Hey everybody, this is Sean Matgamna's introduction to The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2. The two Trotskyisms confront Stalinism. The introduction has 3 parts. This video is going to be part 1. It is looks like it's about 35 pages long. I guess that's probably going to be maybe 3 hours, probably. Maybe 2.5 to 3 hours, probably. Maybe 2 hours and 45 minutes, I imagine, how long it'll take. Maybe it'll take a lot longer, so we'll see if I called it correctly. I want to read this table of contents for this part. Trotsky's evolving analysis, the Trotsky of the paradoxes, the significance for Trotsky of statified industry, Trotsky, feverish flux, a new organic socio-economic formation, quote, in one country, end quote, Trotsky in the 1939-40 dispute and split, the Trotskyist schism, the Orthodox and the heterodox, old antagonisms and the test of events, Trotsky's ambivalent legacy, the fallibility of Trotsky, the Fourth International and the USSR's war, the proletarian military policy, and an appendix titled What Did Happen in, quote, Eastern Poland, end quote, in 1939-40. So, let's get started. Part 1. Trotsky of the Enigmas. During most of the 20th century and the 21st century so far, revolutionary socialist politics has been some form of Trotskyism. It is rooted in the anti-Stalinist tradition that began with Lenin's 1922 attack from his deathbed on Stalin's Russian chauvinist policy in Georgia and continued with his attempt to remove Stalin as general secretary of the ruling party. The left opposition of Trotsky in October 1923 picked up the thread and augmented it. The left opposition and then the united opposition of Zinoviev Trotsky took into themselves some of the criticisms made by earlier Bolshevik oppositions to Lenin and Trotsky, the well-known workers' opposition, the less well-known democratic centralists, and others. The democratic centralists joined the united opposition. The leaders of the workers' opposition, Kollontai and Shliapnikov, went over to Stalin. For the Trotskyists, in Trotsky's lifetime, they preferred to call themselves Bolshevik-Leninists. It has been a very long march through the 20th century and beyond, and over sometimes strange, unexpected, uncharted, and often bewildering terrain. Central to it has been the fight against Stalinism, the attempt to understand and categorize Stalinism, the battle to wipe the labor movement clean of Stalinism. The Trotskyist tradition is nourished by the memory of immense working-class victories. The October 1917 Workers' Revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, the foundation of the Communist International in 1919. It is shaped and also misshaped by the catastrophic defeats of the working class, by Stalinism, fascism, and Pluto-democracy. The Trotskyist tradition encompasses the historical experience of the working class movement in which it participated and which it analyzed, discussed, disputed about. There is no other authentic Marxist-communist tradition. George Santayana's aphorism is not less true for having become a cliché. Quote, "Those who cannot remember their past are condemned to repeat it." End quote. Those that do not know their own history cannot learn from it. A revived revolutionary socialist movement will have to learn from the Trotskyist tradition. As Rosa Luxemburg explained, quote, "What does the entire history of socialism and of all modern revolutions show us? The first spark of class struggle in Europe, the revolt of the silk weavers in Lyon in 1931, I don't know why I said 8, ended with a heavy defeat. The Chartist movement in Britain ended in defeat. The uprising of the Parisian proletariat in the June days of 1848 ended with a crushing defeat, and the Paris Commune ended with a terrible defeat. The whole road of socialism, so far as revolutionary struggles are concerned, is paved with nothing but thunderous defeats. Yet at the same time, history marches inexorably step by step toward final victory! Exclamation point. Where would we be today without those, quote, defeats, end quote, from which we draw historical experience, understanding, power, and idealism? We stand on the foundation of those very defeats because each one contributes to our strength and understanding, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. I wanted to look up who George Santayana is. George Santayana lived from 1863 to 1932. and was a Spanish-American philosopher, essayist, poet, and novelist. Born in Spain, Santayana was raised and educated in the U.S. from the age of 8 and identified himself as an American, although he always retained a valid Spanish passport. At the age of 48, Santayana left his position at Harvard and returned to Europe permanently. Santayana's last will was to be buried in the Spanish Pantheon in Rome. George Santayana is popularly known for aphorisms such as, quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," end quote. Quote, "Only the dead have seen the end of war," end quote. And the definition of beauty as, quote, "pleasure objectified," end quote. Although an atheist, George Santayana treasured the Spanish Catholic values, practices, and worldview in which he was raised. George Santayana was a broad-ranging cultural critic spanning many disciplines. So, back to the text. A reviewer of the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, dismissed it as a, quote, quote, sectariana, end quote. Aim at the sky and you are sure to hit the mark. Certainly the text in that volume and its introduction, like this one, dealt with the politics, problems, conundrums, debates, and disruptions of small and very small organizations. But those were the organizations that attempted to continue and develop the political ideas and practical projects of the early Communist International after the organization had been transformed into a corrupt and vicious political instrument of the ruling oligarchy in the USSR. The concerns and disputes of those small groups dealt with all the political questions that comprise the history of the 20th century. These are the concerns that exercised minds of thinking people for most of that century. George Orwell is widely respected today for his integrity, truth-telling, and dogged honesty. Yet Orwell's viewpoint was a variant of that of the Trotskyist movement, and certainly Orwell was strongly influenced by the Trotskyist movement. New section. Trotsky's evolving analysis. The murderously anti-working class totalitarian state which came to base itself on the 1917 workers' revolution in Russia was less than 2 decades old when Trotsky was struck down. In his historical time, it was a new phenomenon. For Marxists, it was as unexpected and strange as the great continent of America, which loomed up before him, had been for Christopher Columbus when he thought he was en route to India and the East. From the very beginning of his exile from the USSR in 1929, Trotsky and Trotsky's comrades had many disputes among themselves about the exact nature, class content, and historical implications and perspectives of Stalinism and of the territory over which Stalin ruled. Similar discussions and disputes occupied the Bolsheviks jailed and exiled inside the USSR until Stalin killed them all. The USSR itself went through great convulsive changes. The final destruction of the labor movement and the Bolshevik Party, the reduction of the working class itself to what Trotsky would name as semi-slavery, the breakneck industrialization and forced collectivization. Trotsky constantly rethought, reconceptualized, readjusted his thinking on the USSR as on other issues. Trotsky worked by extrapolation, deduction, prognostication on events. Trotsky concretized, adjusted, changed, or abandoned his projections in the light of experience. Often events would lead Trotsky to apply a new description to the USSR and also to say that the new description had already been valid for some time. In 1936, for example, when for the first time he called Stalin's regime, quote, totalitarian, end quote, he wrote, quote, the regime had become, quote, totalitarian, end quote, in character several years before this word arrived from bracket Hitler's and bracket Germany, end quote. By the end of Trotsky's life, events in the first place, the development and unfolding of Stalinism in the USSR and in 1939 to 40 beyond its borders had driven him into a politics of bewildering complexity, Jesuit subtlety, and seemingly extravagant self-contradictions. Trotsky bequeathed to his surviving comrades a large quiver of half-evolved and half-eroded, quote, positions, end quote, ambivalences, and contradictions. The ideological history of the post-Trotsky Trotskyists is the story of their attempts to work through those half-developed and half-eroded ideas in relation to yet new and again unexpected world events. In 1930, Trotsky broke with the biggest group in the left opposition outside Russia, the German Leninbund, and on their attitude to Russia's conflict with China over the Chinese Eastern Railroad. Trotsky was vehemently on the Russian government's side. Until 1933, Trotsky thought that the Stalinist aspects of the Russian state could be, quote, reformed, end quote, out of existence. Even then, Trotsky postulated a special type of reform. Trotsky expected the bungling and irrationally run Stalinist system to encounter disaster. The bureaucracy would begin to break up. The party which Stalin had stifled and paralyzed would regroup and reconstitute itself as a Bolshevik party. In that way, the working class would regain direct power. In 1933, Trotsky shifted to the belief that a, quote, political, end quote, revolution would be needed to break the Stalinist dictatorship. At that stage, Trotsky still wrote of a resurgent Bolshevik party carrying out, quote, police measures, end quote, against the bureaucracy. In 1936, Trotsky deepened and sharpened what he meant by, quote, political revolution, end quote, defining political revolution, in fact, if not in name, as a full-scale working-class revolution against the USSR's, quote, sole commanding stratum, end quote, and its state machine. The direction of Trotsky's politics on the USSR, although all through the 1930s was unmistakable, he inched closer and closer to abandoning the idea that the USSR was a degenerated and degenerating worker state. At the beginning of the 1930s, Trotsky was in public a critical defender of the Russian state. By the end, he is publicly denouncing the Russian bureaucracy's rule as, quote, worse, end quote, than that of any ruling class in history, and publicly calling for a new revolution against it. Trotsky compared Stalin's rule unfavorably with pre-war Hitler's. Like you're saying, it's always important to note when talking about this that Trotsky's writing before Barbarossa and before the Holocaust. So keep that in mind. The separation in the ranks of the Trotskyists in 1940 was the defining branch off of two Trotskyisms for two reasons. It was at the end of Trotsky's life and his last word on the subject of Stalinism, and it marked a decisive turn for Stalinism, the beginning of the Russian expansion that would by 1945 see Russia in control of half of Europe. Trotsky of the Paradoxes. New section. At the end, Trotsky was the theorist of a Russian, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, in which, on his own account, the workers were slaves or, quote, semi-slaves, end quote. From the writing of The Revolution Betrayed, 1936 onwards, Trotsky consistently referred to Stalin's Russia as an oligarchic, quote, totalitarianism, end quote. In the program, Trotsky wrote for the September 1938 conference of the Fourth International. He said, and the movement that adopted the program repeated after him, that Stalin's regime was uniquely reactionary and repressive, different from pre-war Nazi Germany, quote, only in more unbridled savagery, end quote. Quote, the Soviet bureaucracy has all the vices of a possessing class without having any of a possessing class's, quote, virtues, end quote. Organic stability, certain moral norms, etc., end quote. Trotsky. The bureaucracy was, quote, the sole privileged and commanding stratum, end quote. It, quote, devoured a lion's share of the modest national income, end quote, worse than in the USA. Quote, the higher layer of the bureaucracy lives approximately the same kind of life as the well-to-do bourgeois of the United States and other capitalist countries, end quote. Quote, in the USSR, there are 12 to 15 million privileged individuals who concentrate in their hands about 1/2 of the national income and who call this regime, quote, socialism, end quote. On the other hand, there are approximately 160 million people oppressed by the bureaucracy and caught in the grip of dire poverty, end quote. Quote, historically, no class in society has ever concentrated in its hands in such a short time such wealth and power as the bureaucracy has concentrated during the 2 5-year plans, end quote. Trotsky. And yet Trotsky still thought this bureaucracy was not a ruling class. The rule of the slave-driving elite, wrote Trotsky, quote, from the standpoint of the interest and positions of the popular masses, is infinitely worse than any, quote, organic, end quote, exploitation. The bureaucracy is not a possessing class in the scientific sense of the term possessing class, but the bureaucracy contains within the bureaucracy's self to a tenfold degree all the vices of a possessing class, end quote. From the point of view of the workers, the economy functioned worse than capitalism did. The workers suffered, quote, the classic methods of exploitation in such naked and crude forms as it would not be permitted even by reformist trade unions in bourgeois countries, end quote. Quote, the relations between people in many respects are still lagging behind a cultured capitalism, end quote. Quote, the Soviet economy today is neither a monetary nor a planned economy. The Soviet economy is an almost purely bureaucratic economy, ... Industry, freed from the material control of the producer, took on a super social, that is, bureaucratic character. As a result, industry lost the ability to satisfy human wants, even to the degree to which industry had been it had been accomplished by the less developed capitalist industry, end quote. And yet Trotsky vehemently insisted this bureaucracy was not yet a ruling class. In an important sense, the, quote, semi-slave, end quote, working class was still the ruling class. Trotsky himself pointed out that, quote, the means of production belong to the state, but the state, so to speak, quote, belongs, end quote, to the bureaucracy, end quote. And yet Trotsky argued that the state-owned economy rooted in the October Revolution to continue to give the system its, quote, degenerated, end quote, but still worker-state character. The revolution in Stalinist Russia, which Trotsky advocated, would smash the bureaucratic state, replace the bureaucratic state with organs of a democratic workers' state, Soviets, destroy the bureaucrats' plans for the economy, and replace them with working-class planning, democratically decided, vetted, supervised, and adjustable. And yet Trotsky insisted that this revolution, which he had advocated with mounting urgency, was something less than the revolutionary advocated against capitalism. Why? Because in both Stalinism and in a post-Stalinist working-class system of social organization, there would be state ownership. It would be ownership by a different state and a different kind of state, quote, owned, end quote, by a radically different social group, the working class, in place of the Stalinist autocracy. But the common factor of state ownership made this for Trotsky a, quote, political, end quote, and not quite fully social revolution. Trotsky was the keeper of the terrible chronicles of the rise and consolidation of Stalinism on the graves of millions of workers and peasants, of the revolutionary working class movement, and of Bolshevism, and yet he greeted Stalin's statification of property in eastern Poland in 1939-40 as, quote, the strangled and desecrated October Revolution, serving notice that it was still alive, end quote. Trotsky was a bitter critic of the foreign policy that in 1939-41 flowed from the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939. It was more than a non-aggression pact, Trotsky said. It was a partnership. Trotsky denounced, quote, Hitler's quartermaster, end quote, jackal, end quote, Stalin, and yet he was for, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of the USSR and its international dealings. That is, defense irrespective of the Russian government's policies and actions, and even though it acted as in Poland in partnership with the Nazis. He condemned the USSR's invasion of Poland the 17th of September 1939 and Finland 30th of November 1939, and yet when the Finns resisted, he was for the victory of Stalin's army over the Finnish people. Trotsky insisted that, quote, we are and remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote, and that conquest in Poland by the Stalinist state was turning the people into, quote, semi-slaves, end quote. And yet he could not side with those, quote, semi-slaves, end quote, actual or future, for fear of the effect on the fate of that same state, and of what was unique to it because of the working-class October Revolution, nationalized property in some form of economic plan with all the evils he had angrily described, stigmatized, and urged the workers to resist and destroy. Trotsky was a proponent of the theory that the totalitarian bureaucracy was historically for a short time a locum for the working class and for the October Revolution because the bureaucracy retained statified property, and yet he was a mortal opponent of that bureaucracy from its early days. Advocate of the thoroughgoing revolution to extirpate the bureaucracy, Trotsky nonetheless felt obliged to defend the bureaucracy's state and international affairs, quote, unconditionally, end quote, whatever it did and even when he condemned it, so long as it remained the custodian and defender of the statified property. In practice, in face of a stabilization and expansion of Stalinism which Trotsky had not accepted, this attitude raised Russian nationalized property above all other concerns. In Finland, it raised the nationalized property. It raised Russian nationalized property above the freedom of the working class to organize the working class itself, to think and to formulate and express the working class's own politics. Trotsky interpreted, quote, the defense of the USSR against imperialism, end quote, to mean wanting it to be victorious even when it was engaged in an attempt to reduce the Finns and thus the Free Finnish labor movement to what he described as, quote, semi-slavery, end quote, in relation to Poland 3 months earlier. Trotsky was an inveterate defender of the rights of the oppressed nationalities in the USSR, and yet Trotsky defended the USSR in its war to subjugate the Finns because he thought the Russo-Finnish War would quickly merge into the Second World War. Trotsky denounced Stalin's policy in Finland sharply. Trotsky wrote, quote, during the war with Finland, not only the majority of the Finnish peasants, but also the majority of the Finnish working class proved to be on the side of their bourgeoisie. This is hardly surprising, since they know of the unprecedented oppression to which the Stalinist bureaucracy subjects the workers of nearby Leningrad and the whole of the USSR, end quote. And yet he felt obliged to side with Stalin in Finland. Shortly after Stalin's invasion of Poland in partnership with Hitler's Germany and agreed by the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Trotsky wrote, quote, in every case, the Fourth International will know how to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction, and where it defends the social basis of the USSR, end quote. He bitterly condemned Stalin's policy in Poland and Finland, yet when in 1939-40 some of Trotsky's comrades tried to separate off what should be, quote, defended, quote, unconditionally, from what should be condemned as an expression of the oligarchy and its drives, appetites, and interests, and when they argued that, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, could not be, quote, unconditional, end quote, Trotsky demanded and condemned them. Trotsky denounced and condemned them. Trotsky described the invasions of Poland and Finland as above all a, quote, extension of the territory dominated by bureaucratic autocracy and parasitism, end quote. And yet Trotsky still felt obliged to, quote, defend, end quote, the Stalinist system's forcible extension by Stalin beyond the USSR's borders, because the alternative, once the USSR was endangered, was or might be defeat for the progressive potential of the USSR's nationalized economy. Against, quote, conjunctural defeatism, end quote, siding with the USSR in wars only, quote, conjuncturally, end quote, i.e. in some circumstances, Trotsky recalled the legend of, quote, Columbus and the egg, end quote. Christopher Columbus challenged his companions to make an egg stand on its end. When they couldn't, he smashed one end of the egg on the table, flattening it. Thus he could make the egg, the no longer quite itself egg, stand on that end. After Columbus's example, anyone could do the same thing. Thus too with defeatism. Do it once on the periphery of the Thus with defeatism, do defeatism once on the periphery of the World War, where inevitably there would be cross currents and complications, and you would find it much easier to do in other situations. Trotsky feared that the, quote, conjunctural defeatism, end quote, which he himself had seemed to advocate, quote, the Fourth International will know how to distinguish, end quote, might slide into a comprehensive defeatism. He feared to disorient his comrades when, soon in the World War, the Stalinist system would collapse and the bureaucracy would shatter, and the fate of what appeared to be the remaining legacy of the 1917 revolution would become the living axis of politics. In fact, the collapse didn't happen, the bureaucracy didn't shatter, and most of those who were, quote, Russian defeatists, end quote, in the Russian-Finnish War would soon reject, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, entirely. For fear of the spread of a general Trotskyist defeatism, Trotsky took a position which flew in the face of Trotsky's denunciation of what Stalin was doing and would do in Finland. Trotsky's stance meant taking a position on Finland motivated not by what was happening and would happen with a Russian victory there, but by concern for something else, general defense of the USSR against the big imperialist powers by way of the, quote, Columbus and the egg, end quote, parable. Trotsky said plainly that that was what he was doing. When Max Shachtman tried to insist on answers on their merits to the, quote, concrete questions, end quote, Trotsky angrily dismissed him as a mere coiner of journalistic jargon. Trotsky was an international socialist who felt the need for auxiliary theses beyond those of the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, and the, quote, progressive economy, end quote, to buttress defense of the USSR, reached for arguments indistinguishable from those of Russian Marxist social patriot George Plekhanov for defending the Tsar's Russia in World War I. Russia would be reduced to a colony if it were defeated. When a comrade, Simone Weil, who was to become well known as a mystical philosopher, pointed this out, Trotsky responded gnomically that she had a, quote, right to understand nothing. If you didn't know this, if you read Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, Simone Weil was one of the first people within the Marxist milieu to come to a thesis that the USSR is neither socialist nor capitalist, but some type of bureaucratic collectivist non-capitalist class society. Her and who's the other guy that was Lucien Leroy were some early forerunners of like the bureaucratic collectivism thesis, even though it seems like the people within the Trotskyist milieu that came to the bureaucratic collectivism thesis on the USSR did so independently. I don't see any evidence. I don't think there's any evidence that like Simone Weil or Lucien Leroy influenced, for instance, Max Shachtman or James Burnham or Joseph Carter, who would have been the main proponents of some form of bureaucratic collectivist analysis in the Trotskyist milieu at that time. Excuse me. I discuss these issues in greater detail in the introduction to The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, which is on this channel. Some of these paradoxes are plain, flat contradictions. Most can be understood in terms of Trotsky's increasingly feverish attempts to grasp and define the new Stalinist system and to hold on to the perspective on contemporary history as a, quote, era of wars and revolutions, end quote, on the certainty of which the Bolsheviks had made the October Revolution. Yet as we will see, the later political evolution of Trotsky's co-thinkers in the 1939-40 dispute would mock his fear that it would be an open-ended precedent if the Trotskyists came out for, quote, conjunctural defeatism, end quote, against the USSR in the Russo-Finnish War. The precedent set by Trotsky's, quote, Russian defensism, end quote, on Finland, and by Trotsky's speculations about social upheavals triggered by the, quote, Red Army, end quote, in eastern Poland, and maybe Trotsky thought in Finland too, those would be the, quote, precedents, end quote, that would begin to reshape and warp, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Trotskyism within a year of Trotsky's death. New section. The significance for Trotsky of statified industry. Trotsky read off the class structure of the USSR from the origins in the 1917 working class revolution of the statified property that characterized it. At the same time, Trotsky remembered and said that the statified property in Stalin's USSR was radically different in kind from the statified property in the early worker state, as well as far more pervasive. It was not less radically different from the statified property of a future regenerated USSR after a new workers' revolution under working class control and planning. Trotsky argued that the fully statified property was inexplicable apart from the working class revolution which had overthrown the old ruling class. Quote, the first concentration of the means of production in the hands of the state to occur in history was achieved by the proletariat with the method of social revolution and not by capitalists with the method of state trustification, end quote. The Russian system was unique. This was central to Trotsky's reasoning. What he saw as the post-bourgeois nationalized economy in Russia was unique in the world. It could not have come into existence without the prior destruction of by the working class of the Russian bourgeoisie. When the revolution came to be isolated and declined, the bureaucracy expropriated the working class and made itself, in Trotsky's words, quote, the sole master of the surplus product, end quote. Stalinist bureaucracy did not create the nationalized economy. Its rule was a negation, but also a continuation of the revolution. By way of the survival of nationalized property, it performed no essential function in the economy that the working class could not have done better. The bureaucracy was a parasitic formation on the workers' state, an epiphenomenon, not an independent force in history. Without the working class revolution, there could have been no statified economy in the USSR. Because, as Trotsky believed, the bureaucracy was so unstable and historically unviable, the nationalized property still gave the state a predominant, albeit a residual working-class character, or more exactly a, quote, post-working-class revolution, and not yet definitely anything else, end quote, character. As yet, the USSR remained a degenerated and degenerating worker state, or more precisely, so Trotsky thought and said, it was better to go on seeing it like that for a while longer, until all the contradictory variables were tested, as they would be in the World War. Quote, might we not place ourselves in a ludicrous position if we affixed to the Bonapartist oligarchy the nomenclature of a new ruling class just a few years or even a few months prior to its inglorious downfall, end quote. Trotsky had admitted in September 1939 that the USSR as it might have to be that the USSR as it was might have to be reinterpreted as a, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, society. The linchpin of his entire position by 1939 was, wait a while. Trotsky saw the nationalized economy as the empirical evidence that the revolution had not been entirely destroyed, and thus for Trotsky's, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, theory. But the criterion was not just the nationalized economy, quote, in itself, end quote. It was the nationalized economy as seen in the perspective of its origin, the workers' revolution, and then of the revolution's, quote, political, end quote, defeat by the bureaucracy. Trotsky saw the nationalized economy as necessarily, as well as in terms of historical fact, linked to the October Revolution. There was no other way it could have come to exist. The criterion was a question of four elements. 1. The agency, the working class, and its revolution. 2. The empirical evidence of what remained of October, the statified property. 3. The fact that the level of statification in the USSR was, then, unique in the world. And 4. The fact that the statified economy of Russia bore some resemblance, even in its grossly deformed Stalinist reality, and in a backward country, to the social administration of the economy that the working class revolution, as the heir to advanced capitalism, would create. The origin of statified property in the 1917 revolution reinforced this fourth consideration, but for Trotsky it could not have been nationalized property, quote, alone, end quote. From 1937, Trotsky began to dismantle and remodel his own edifice of theory when, quote, for the sake of argument, end quote, he separated his idea that Russia was still, in a very deformed sense, a worker state, from the idea that the system of statified and bureaucratized planning was historically progressive. It was progressive, he argued, because it developed the forces of production in an epoch of great and all-pervasive capitalist decline. Against a French comrade, Ivan Clépieux, he argued that Stalin's USSR was an exploitative class state. Trotsky wrote, quote, when we are faced with the struggle between two states which are, let us admit it, both class states, but one of which represents imperialist stagnation and the other tremendous economic progress, do we not have to support the progressive state against the reactionary state? ... Whatever its modes of exploitation may be, this new society is, by its very character, superior to capitalist society. There you have the real point of departure for Marxist analysis, end quote, Trotsky. And there, too, in Trotsky's idea, you have the starting point for the post-Trotsky Orthodox Trotskyist theory of the, quote, deformed, end quote, parenthesis, deformed, not degenerated, end parenthesis, worker states. These would be states approximating Russia in their structure and consequently would be considered progressive and labeled, quote, worker states, end quote, to signal that progressiveness, but states with the working class, which the working class, as a class, had played no part in creating, as in Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, Cuba. In that 1937 polemic, when Trotsky Trotsky represented Russia's nationalized economy as progressive per se. 2 years later in the USSR and war, September 1939, Trotsky wrote that it would be progressive only if and when the bureaucracy ceased to rule over it. Quote, in order that nationalized property in the occupied areas of Eastern Poland as well as in the USSR become a basis for genuinely progressive, that is to say, socialist development, it is necessary to overthrow the Moscow bureaucracy, end quote. He declared in his open letter to the Russian workers of May 1940 that, quote, the surviving conquest of the October Revolution, end quote, the nationalized industry and the collectivized Soviet economy, end quote, would, quote, serve the people only if they prove themselves capable of dealing with the Stalinist bureaucracy, as in their day they dealt with the Tsarist bureaucracy and the bourgeoisie, end quote. In plain words, by then, Trotsky saw the statified economy of the USSR as progressive only on condition that the working class took power there. On one level, this was as big an innovation as the shift in September 1939 to the view that it might become necessary to reconceptualize the USSR exactly as it was without further, quote, degeneration, end quote, as a form of exploitative class society, and it raised the question, what was now left of Trotsky's post-1937 reasons for, quote, defending the USSR, end quote. Trotsky. New section. Trotsky, feverish flux. To recapitulate, Trotsky believed that in the Stalinist system, the state-owned economy was a result of the destruction of the old ruling classes by the working class revolution and ultimately a product of the new economic foundation laid by the revolution. The workers had been politically expropriated by a bureaucratic counter-revolution, and socially too. In his attempt to distinguish between grades of counter-revolution, Trotsky did not in any degree deny that. What Trotsky proposed that the working class should fight for against the bureaucracy, destruction of the totalitarian state apparatus, Soviet democracy, a working class controlled economic plan, etc., spelled it out clearly. The new autocracy drove the people like the worst slave masters in history. The new autocracy had concentrated power over society unparalleled in history, yet it maintained, and indeed after 1929-30 had vastly extended statified property. It was the autocracy's form of property, rooted in their political counter-revolution, their political expropriation of the working class, and in their way of administering the socio-economic system. But also, more fundamentally, it was rooted in the great transformation accomplished by the October Revolution. The ruling oligarchy maintained that which, in broad social, economic, and historical terms, distinguished the USSR from the capitalist world. In Trotsky's view, this was a, quote, transitional, end quote, phenomenon of necessarily short duration and unexpected phase in the protracted decline and degeneration of the October Revolution, albeit one which, because the fetters of capitalism had been thrown off, still allowed a tremendous development of the forces of production. Trotsky knew and said that much of the economic success of the 1930s depended on the savage slave driving of the workers and the rural population by the autocracy, and Trotsky believed that they could not possibly go beyond a very partial and patchy catch-up towards the level of advanced capitalism. Trotsky put forward a program of working-class self-defense and political reassertion against the autocracy. Trotsky analyzed and described the system, which he considered unviable, as a flux of history degenerating at an accelerating rate rather than having degenerated finitely into a durable socio-economic formation. For decades after World War II, almost all observers, friendly or hostile, would see the USSR as an established and, so to speak, settled and stabilized socio-economic formation. Trotsky saw it not at all like that. For Trotsky, it was a temporary conjunction of conditions which had to give way and soon, either to bourgeois counter-revolution or to a working-class, quote, political, end quote, revolution against the autocracy. Before September 1939, when Trotsky declared that a new way of conceptualizing the USSR, as it was, might in due course be necessary, he saw the system as a freak of history arising from the political destruction of working-class power in the USSR, combined with the anachronistic maintenance of economic forms rooted in the October Revolution, whose survival in such conditions had been possible only because of the prolonged crisis of world capitalism after 1929. Repeatedly, Trotsky saw the downfall of this system as imminent in the crisis of collectivization before 1933, when there was a temporary consolidation, and with the beginning of the purges in 1935 to 36, which Trotsky initially saw as the death convulsions of the system. Trotsky thought it certain that Russia would be drawn into the World War, and that in the war its current regime would collapse one way or another under capitalist conquest or under workers' revolution. In other words, Trotsky's analyses of Stalinism at the end of his life were in feverish flux and seen by Trotsky himself as provisional and ongoing. New section. A new organic socioeconomic formation, quote, in one country, end quote, question mark? To understand why Trotsky refused to, quote, affix to the Bonapartist oligarchy the nomenclature of a new ruling class, end quote, we need to stand back from the immediate situation of 1940. In refusing at the start of World War II to classify the USSR as a class exploitative society, Trotsky stood on the self-same ground as when in 1924 and after he rejected the Stalin-Bukharin theory of socialism in one country. The immediate focus of the disputes in the mid-20s around the doctrine of socialism in one country, the ideological banner under which the bureaucracy consolidated the bureaucracy's power, was properly its short-term implications. Socialism, that is, a developed socialist society on a higher level than the most advanced capitalism, and in one country, question mark? So there would be no other working class revolution in the whole epoch in which socialism was being constructed in the USSR. The communist parties throughout the world would no longer work to make revolutions in their own countries, question mark? They would function mainly as frontier guards to, quote, defend, end quote, and serve the interests of the state in which socialism was being built, question mark? Plainly, in this schema, there would be no other working-class revolutions, and the non-Russian communist parties would become international guardians and diplomatic and political pawns for the government of the socialist state building. A building. The government of the socialist state, a building. I don't know if that's a typo or if that's like a building, like as in like ongoing. And in fact they did, and very quickly. There was also a more profound theoretical reason for rejecting socialism in one country. The program of working-class communist revolution is grounded on the level of production attained by capitalism on a world scale, and on the basis of the worldwide division of labor. Only that level of production, and what could be developed out of that level of production by the working class, would provide the necessary minimum social and economic basis for a socialist society and for abolishing classes. A, quote, socialism, end quote, in a backward country confined to its own resources and inabilities, severing at least some of its connections with the world market, could only be a sham. As Marx had reasoned, quote, a development of the productive forces is the absolutely necessary practical premise, bracket, of communism, end bracket, because without it want is generalized, and with want the struggle for necessities begins again, and that means all the old crap must revive, end quote. In the mid-20s, Trotsky put forward an ambitious program of economic development which the Stalinists and Bukharinites rejected. But the idea that the USSR in isolation and parallel to capitalism would build itself all the way to socialism was a new version, on a gigantic scale, of the projects of 19th century utopian socialists who would set out to create new societies in the wildernesses of the USA or some such, quote, virgin, end quote, place. Marxists argue that socialism would have to develop from capitalism and be won by the proletariat, that is, by one of the classes within capitalism and created by capitalist society. It could never come from outside advanced capitalism, rise in competition with it, and go on to surpass it. For Trotsky in 1939 to 40, the idea of the USSR being a new form of class society implied that it was not a freak of history, a, quote, accidental, end quote, combination of circumstances, but a relatively stable, quote, historically established, end quote, and viable system. The objections to the ideas of a new stabilized, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, system emerging in isolation on the edges of capitalism and then surpassing capitalism were identical to the objections to, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. Trotsky in the late 1930s took it as fact that capitalism had ceased to develop on a world scale and was in historical regression. Short of socialist revolution, a series of world wars and with them, quote, the eclipse of civilization, end quote, were certain. It was only in such a world of catastrophically declining capitalism that Stalinism could survive and prosper, and so he wrote, if generalized internationally, stabilize as a new form of exploitative class society. Trotsky admitted, in effect, the theoretical possibility that the USSR was already established as a new exploitative class society, a semi-slave society, but a definite conclusion that it was so would mean a big step away from his general conception of necessary historical evolution. So Trotsky held back. That Russia was still a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, was not something Trotsky put forward as a long-term perspective. Trotsky said plainly that it was a very short-term perspective. Trotsky did not envisage long-term Stalinism in one country or in many backward countries. When he described the USSR as a, quote, transitional, end quote, formation, as he sometimes did, he did not mean that the expression came to mean his Orthodox followers, a stable society and transition to socialism. Trotsky's thought of Stalin's autocracy as too unstable for it to venture on international expansion more than marginally. Quote, the idea of Stalin Sovietizing Germany is absurd as Chamberlain's hope for the restoration of a peaceful conservative monarchy in Germany, end quote. Trotsky wrote, parenthesis, December 1939, end parenthesis. James Buchanan, the man who had shaped post-Trotsky Orthodox Trotskyism, was even more clear-cut than Trotsky on this. Quote, Stalin could take the path of Napoleonic conquest not merely against small border states, but against the greatest imperialist powers only on one condition, that the Soviet bureaucracy in reality represents a new triumphant class which is in harmony with its economic system and secure in its position at home, etc. If such is really the case, we certainly must revise everything we have said on the subject of the bureaucracy up to now, end quote. Parenthesis, letter to Trotsky, 8th of November, 1939, end parenthesis. The time frame in Trotsky's argument that the USSR could not develop as an alternative economic model in parallel to capitalism was vastly mistaken, out by half a century, but his fundamental reasoning about the impossibility of a new social order developing on the edges of advanced capitalism and in competition with it, rather than from its inner contradictions and historical achievements, on that he was not mistaken. The USSR, after competing with a revived and thriving capitalism for decades and being drawn into arms competition with the USA, which it could not sustain, went down to defeat and destruction. New section. Trotsky in the 1939 to 40 dispute and in the split. By the eve of Leon Trotsky's death in August 1940, the American Trotskyist organization, which was by far the most important of the Trotskyist groups, had split over, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, in Poland and Finland, and over how the Trotskyists should organize and conduct their party affairs. Parenthesis, there would have been no split on, quote, defensism, end quote, had it not been for the organizational disputes and the, quote, canon regime, end quote, in the party, end parenthesis. Two currents of Trotskyism had begun the process of complete separation, but as yet only begun. It would take most of a decade before the evolution of two distinct species was more or less complete. To change the image, in 1940 the two Trotskyisms were two dialectics of one political current. By 1950 the dialects had... To change the image, in 1940, the two Trotskyisms were two dialectics of one political current. By 1950, the dialects had... To change the image, in 1940, the two Trotskyisms were two dialects. So used to saying dialectics of one political current. By 1950, the dialects had evolved into two political languages whose speakers often no longer understood each other. There's no question where Trotsky stood in the split and the events that led up to it, solidly with Cannon and the, quote, defenders of the USSR, end quote. Indeed, Trotsky was the main political writer on that side of the divide. On the underlying political and theoretical issues, the picture is nothing like as clear-cut. In the long essay, The USSR in War, which Trotsky finished in mid-September 1939, he broke radically new ground. For the first time, he accepted that the USSR, as it was, without further degeneration, might have to be reclassified as a new and hitherto unknown type of class exploitative society. If the World War produced not the overthrow one way or another of Stalinism, but the spread of Stalinist-type regimes across the world, then, quote, it would be necessary in retrospect to establish that in its fundamental traits, the present USSR was the precursor of a new exploiting regime on an international scale, end quote. Trotsky. When some of Trotsky's American comrades, parentheses, some of them in mockery, end parentheses, branded such an idea as, quote, revisionism, end quote, Trotsky replied in October 1939 with again and once more on the question of the USSR, in which he dismissed such condemnation as know-nothing dogmatizing. Again, all these pieces are on the channel. Quote, some comrades evidently were surprised that I spoke in my article of the system of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, as a theoretical possibility. These comrades discovered in this even a complete revision of Marxism. This is an apparent misunderstanding. The Marxist comprehension of historical necessity has nothing in common with fatalism, bracket, if the working class fails to take power, end bracket, fascism on one hand, degeneration of the Soviet state on the other, outline the social and political forms of a neo-barbarism, end quote. Trotsky suggested that the, quote, further decay of monopoly capitalism's further fusion with the state and the replacement of democracy wherever democracy still remained by a totalitarian regime, end quote, might produce a similar structure. If Stalin's system on a world scale would be an exploitative slave society, what was the Stalinist 1/6 of the world in the USSR? Logically, there was only one answer to the question posed by Trotsky's reasoning. Russia was already an exploitative slave society. Trotsky had said explicitly that, looking back from the future, the socialists might have to accept that the USSR was already in 1939 the, quote, precursor of a new exploiting regime on an international scale, end quote. Was there some additional quality which the Russian Stalinist system would get from participating in a worldwide network of similar states? Yes, there was. Stability in the elimination of pressure and rivalry from an inimical advanced capitalism. But in terms of the social structure and the roles of social groups in it, especially of the working class, in this putative slave society world, Stalinist Russia would remain itself. Trotsky believed that the USSR would give way either to a workers' revolution or to capitalist restoration, and soon. The great test would be the World War, which was already being fought and which would reach Russia 10 months after Trotsky's death. The war would decide the fate of the USSR. Quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, had been seen as defending a Russia under attack from imperialist states, and on the defensive. In eastern Poland, the USSR was expanding its territory as Hitler's partner in imperialist rapine and plunder. Was Russia then to be seen as imperialist? The disputes that erupted around that question were heated, but more terminology and historical perspective than about the substance of what Russia was and what it was doing. The majority of the peoples of the USSR were not great Russians, but members of distinct nations. The Bolsheviks, in 1917 and after, had to tear down the walls of what had been called the Tsarist, quote, prison house of nations, end quote. At the very start of the left opposition against the rising oligarchy, Lenin from his deathbed had indicated the Georgian Stalin for his, quote, indicted the Georgian Stalin for his, quote, great Russian chauvinist, end quote, treatment of Georgia. As Stalinism developed, its rigid bureaucratic centralizing Russian state power subordinated all segments of the apparatus to firm Moscow control. It should be noted that this was an attitude that Lenin was criticizing. Lenin fully endorsed the Soviet invasion of Georgia to overthrow the Menshevik government that was in formation there. As Stalinism developed, its rigid bureaucratic centralizing Russian state power subordinated all segments of the apparatus to firm Moscow control. It thereby made the formal autonomy of the smaller nations in the USSR more or less meaningless. In this way, Stalin re-erected and higher than before the walls of the old great Russian prison house of nations. The Trotskyist proposal to smash the bureaucracy and revive Bolshevism in the USSR meant also freeing the channels of self-determination for the smaller peoples in the USSR. In 1939, when Trotsky had called for the independence of a Soviet Ukraine, Trotsky had to defend the idea against both dogmatic semi-Trotskyists, parenthesis, the Olerites, a mid-30s breakaway from the American Party, and such reflex Russian patriots and chauvinists as Alexander Kerensky. The one-time Russian Prime Minister whom Lenin and Trotsky had chased out of Petrograd in October 1917. I want to read Uhler's biography real quick on Wikipedia. Said Hugo Uhler lived from 1903 to 1983. Hugo Uhler was an American Trotskyist. Biography. An active trade unionist, Hugo Uhler, I don't know if I'm saying this name right, Oehler, joined the Communist Party USA in the Communist Party USA's earliest days, and by 1927 was a district organizer for the party in Kansas. Hugo Uhler was also known for his ability to organize workers both in the southern textile mills and the mines of Colorado. At the 7th National Convention of the Communist Party USA in 1930, Hugo Uhler controversially demanded that the Trotskyists be permitted to rejoin the party, abruptly ending his career with the official party. Hugo Uhler then joined James P. Cannon, Max Shachtman, and Martin Aburn in the Communist League of America, the nation's first Trotskyist group. Hugo Uhler was soon elected to the group's governing national committee. Hugo Uhler remained a prominent member of the League, serving on the Committee of the International Labor Defense following the Luray Mill strike. Hugo Uhler organized unemployed workers during the Minneapolis Teamster strike of 1934. In 1934, the Communist League merged with A.J. Must's American Workers' Party, becoming the Workers' Party of the United States, and later entered the Socialist Party of America as part of Trotsky's, quote, French turn, end quote. Hugo Uhler objected to this entrism as a tactic, believing that it would lead to the group becoming influenced by reformism, although once the group had entered, Uhler argued that it should not leave, as this would be unprincipled. As a result, Hugo Uhler exited the Workers' Party in November 1935 to form the Revolutionary Workers' League with Tom Stamm and Sidney Lenz. Sidney Lenz wrote an important book titled The Labor Wars. During the Spanish Civil War, the RWL supported only the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. Uhler visited Spain to report for the Revolutionary Workers' League, where Hugo Uhler was involved in the Barcelona May Day's struggles, and wrote Barcelona Barricades about Uhler's experience. When Hugo Uhler tried to leave the country, Hugo Uhler was arrested on charges of spying and held without communication with the outside world for a month before eventually being permitted to return home. In 1937, Hugo Uhler broke with Leon Trotsky, concluding that Trotsky had split with Marxism in 1934. Stamm countered that Trotsky had degenerated in 1928, and the two split. In 1934, Hugo Uhler severely criticized Trotsky's position for an independent Ukraine. In a polemic, Hugo Uhler described his main differences with the Trotskyists as being, quote, on revolutionary defeatism, on support for left bourgeois governments, on support for third capitalist parties, end quote. With the declaration of the Trotskyist Fourth International, Hugo Uhler concentrated on finding international contacts, which he grouped into the Provisional International Contact Commission for the new Communist Fourth International. However, World War II proved the start of a dramatic decline of the Revolutionary Workers' League. That's what RWS, yeah. Which appeared to have been disbanded in the early 1950s, and Uhler faded into obscurity. In the 1970s, Hugo Uhler lived in Denver, Colorado, and was interviewed there by Prometheus Research Library archivist Carl Lichtenstein. Back to the text. Let me reread that sentence. In 1939, when Trotsky had called for the independence of a Soviet Ukraine, Trotsky had to defend the idea against both dogmatic semi-Trotskyists (the Ularites, a mid-30s breakaway from the American Party) and such reflex Russian patriots and chauvinists as Alexander Kerensky, the one-time Russian prime minister whom Lenin and Trotsky had chased out of Petrograd in October 1917. The implications of the call for Ukrainian independence ran right through Stalin's internal USSR, quote, empire, end quote. In 1939, Trotsky published bitter criticism of Stalin's, quote, shameful and criminal, end quote, invasion of Poland. Trotsky refused to use the term, quote, imperialism, end quote, for the USSR, but in fact the terms of his refusal to do so conceded that Stalinist expansion amounted to imperialism, quote, in the widest sense of the word, end quote. Quote, history has known the, quote, imperialism, end quote, of the Roman state based on slave labor, the imperialism of feudal land ownership, the imperialism of commercial and industrial capital, the imperialism of the czarist monarchy, etc. The driving force behind the Moscow bureaucracy is indubitably the tendency to expand the Moscow bureaucracy's power, the Moscow bureaucracy's prestige, the Moscow bureaucracy's revenues. This is the element of, quote, imperialism, end quote, in the widest sense of the word, which was a property in the past of all monarchies, oligarchies, ruling castes, medieval estates, and classes. However, in contemporary literature, at least Marxist literature, imperialism is understood to mean the expansionist policy of finance capital, ... end quote. Stalin invaded Finland on the 30th of November 1939 after Russia's demand for military bases in Finland was rejected. Trotsky denounced that invasion too. Quote, the invasion of Finland, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, indubitably provokes a silent condemnation by the majority of the population in the USSR, end quote. But seeing the conflict is inseparable from the World War, Trotsky favored the victory of the USSR. Trotsky feared that the Finnish conflict would lead to British and French intervention. Over Finland, far more than in relation to Poland, Trotsky insisted that the necessary condemnation of Stalin's invasion was secondary to a more basic question, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote. Quote, behind the Finnish question, as behind the question of the errors and crimes of the Kremlin, stands the problem of the existence of the USSR. The USSR's defeat in the World War would signify the crushing not only of the totalitarian bureaucracy, but also the planned state economy. The USSR's defeat in the World War would convert the country into a colonial booty for the imperialist states, end quote. The Trotskyist Schism, the Orthodox and the Heterodox. Stalin's invasion of Poland triggered a dispute in the American Trotskyist movement between a majority led by James P. Cannon and a minority led by Max Shachtman. It would end with a split down the middle of the party on the 16th of April 1940. The heterodox Trotskyists launched themselves as the Workers' Party 10 days later on the 26th of April 1940. The heterodox Trotskyists produced a single-sheet issue of labor action in time for May Day 1940, and by then, the Workers' Party had already produced the April number of the New International magazine as the Workers' Party's publication, as editors, Burnham and Shachtman had been the registered owners, end parenthesis. The first weekly labor action appeal on the 20th of May 1940. The first weekly labor action appeared on the 20th of May 1940. It's important to note that the Socialist Workers' Party more or less accused Burnham and Shachtman and the Workers' Party of stealing New International, even though Burnham and Shachtman were the editors, and according to them at least, I haven't looked at the documents myself, but the people that constituted the majority in the Socialist Workers' Party up until the split especially James P. Cannon, showed very little interest in New International, and even some people tried to stop the publication of New International. And I don't think Cannon went that far, but he definitely didn't condemn the people who said that the theoretical organ of the Socialist Workers' Party was just a waste of time. As always in such splits, a lot of people simply quit. The Workers' Party consolidated as members fewer than the number of the Socialist Workers' Party and Young People's Socialist League (youth group) people that they had in the faction fight. The dispute was nothing like as clear-cut as it is almost universally summed up as having been. Contrary to most retellings, the dispute was not about whether the USSR remained a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, or must be reckoned as a new exploitative class state. And it was not about whether or not to, quote, defend the USSR, end quote, against big power invasions. With not many exceptions, the minority, the future, quote, heterodox Trotskyists, end quote, including Max Shachtman, agreed with Trotsky that Russia was a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote. Shachtman had, quote, doubts, end quote, but Trotsky too had, quote, doubts, end quote, and expressed those doubts in September 1939 by sketching out alternative futures for the USSR. The minority also agreed that against a big imperialist onslaught, the Trotskyists should and would, quote, defend the USSR, end quote. The faction fight in the American Trotskyist movement was focused politically on whether, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, could guide them in the war which Russia waged against Finland between the 30th of November 1939 and March 1940, and, organizationally, on the, quote, Cannon regime, end quote, in the Socialist Workers' Party, which the opposition defined as, quote, Zinoviev-ite, end quote. That meant, akin to the Communist International around 1924-26, in its early stages of political corruption and debasement by demagogy and of party machine rule. At the start, when Poland was invaded, Albert Goldman moved a motion, quote, to approve of Stalin's invasion of Poland, end quote. Goldman would shift radically in the mid-1940s and join the Shachtman Workers' Party, but in 1939 to 1940, Goldman was a leading writer and speaker of the Cannon Group. Cannon, as well as Shachtman, opposed Goldman's motion to, quote, approve, end quote, the invasion. Cannon's attitude, as Shachtman recounted it, was that it was, quote, purely a military question, and we were in no position to express ourselves affirmatively or negatively on it, end quote. Trotsky, in his first comment on the public press, wrote that the invasion was, quote, not a question of emancipating an oppressed people, but rather one of extending the territory where bureaucratic oppression and parasitism will be practiced, end quote. Quote, the Red Army received the order to defeat in Poland those who had been defeated by Hitler. Quote, the Red Army received the order to defeat in Poland those who had been defeated by Hitler. This is the shameful and criminal task that the Red Army was assigned by the jackals of the Kremlin, end quote. Trotsky. Cannon and Cannon's group then condemned the invasion, and they would also condemn Russia's invasion of Finland, so they now agreed with the minority? No. The majority insisted that the real, basic, and primary question was, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote. In effect, that they should also, quote, defend, end quote, what they denounced, Russia's invasion of Finland. Cannon and his comrades saw the minority's views as sliding towards a general renunciation of, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, and on that they were right. Shachtman and his comrades saw the majority's views as sliding towards alignment with Stalinist imperialism and, quote, bureaucratic revolution, end quote, and Shachtman and his comrades were right too, but that all lay in the future. This dispute became fierce after the USSR's invasion of Finland on the 30th of November. In Finland, unlike in eastern Poland, there was an ongoing war which produced a lurch by the Cannonites to what they called, quote, Soviet patriotism, end quote. Parenthesis, the militant, 9th of December 1939, though that was accompanied by Trotsky's anti-Stalinist polemics, end parenthesis. The dispute was immediately about whether in their underlying, quote, theoretical, end quote, approach, parenthesis, as distinct, for example, from Trotsky's journalistic comments, end parenthesis, the Trotskyists should want Russia to win in Finland. Should they, then and if possible, help Russia to win? Should they tell the Finnish labor movement, which would be extirpated if Stalin occupied Finland, to wish for Russian victory over the Finnish people and act where possible to facilitate that victory? Faced with such questions, Trotsky's whole system of politics began to disintegrate because of its inner contradictions. The split process took on a momentum of its own. On one side, Cannon and his comrades had initially declared that the organization could not, quote, afford the luxury of a new discussion, end quote. Trotsky had insisted that there should be discussion, but when Cannon and Cannon's comrades started denouncing the minority as the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, guilty not of mistaken views within a Marxist common framework, but of capitulation to U.S. public opinion, Trotsky joined in. The minority responded by raising the demand that they be allowed to put out a public bulletin of their own with their distinctive views on the USSR, while still contributing to, supporting, and circulating the Socialist Workers' Party press. The split came on the 16th of April 1940. The USSR's war in Finland had finished on the 13th of March 1940. The USSR was 14 months away from war, the USA 20. For some time after April 1940, in nearly every respect, the new organization set up by the minority, the Workers' Party, would be a smaller twin of the Socialist Workers' Party. The precipitating factor for the split was not the heat of a current political dispute, but the majority's refusal to let the minority publish a public bulletin. In fact, the majority rushed to a split without even waiting to see whether the minority would break party discipline and publish a bulletin. Armed with a resolution from the 5th to 8th April conference, the Cannon Group confronted the Shachtman Group at the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee on the 16th of April, 1940, see the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, page 270, end parenthesis. Cannon produced a two-part proposal. The first part said, quote, that the committee accepts the convention decisions and obligates itself to carry them out in a disciplined manner, end quote. The leaders of the convention minority abstained on that. The second said that those members of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee, a broader body, end parenthesis, who abstained were suspended from the Socialist Workers' Party, and that was that. According to Shachtman, quote, when Cannon had us, quote, finished off, end quote, Cannon turned from his watch to his colleagues with the triumphant remark, quote, only 4½ minutes, end quote, end quote. For Cannon, it was the dawn of a new era, of a, quote, tightened up, quote, Cannonite, end quote, Socialist Workers' Party. Nobody saw the demand for a special minority bulletin or its prohibition as matters of principle. Two things ruled out conciliation, the baiting and demonizing of the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, and the minority's experience of being refused even a hearing in some Cannon-controlled Socialist Workers' Party branches, including Minneapolis, the most important branch outside New York. Including Minneapolis, the most important branch outside New York. See page 509, end parenthesis. Why sensible people, if they did not want a split, would think two competing parties better than a public minority bulletin is not self-evident. The argument essentially was that this opposition, especially degenerate, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, bending under the pressure of public opinion, could not have a bulletin or even have much space in the Socialist Workers' Party press. The production of a minority bulletin with a line on the USSR different from that of the majority might, under the impact of events, have led to a split at a later stage, but in the meantime the duplication of effort from having two competing Trotskyist groups with very similar politics would have been avoided, and the politics could have been clearer. The best outcome would, of course, have been that the two groups in a common party discussion positively interacted with and modified each other. Had the Socialist Workers' Party of April 1940 not split, it is conceivable that the wild, quasi-Stalinist zigzags of The Militant, the magazine, in the first few months of the Russo-German War, see below, could have happened. The strange ideas which the Orthodox deployed, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, the description of the USSR as, quote, the workers' state, end quote, without qualification, etc., could not have been imposed on the organization by the simple say-so of Cannon and his co-thinkers in the editorial office. But the Shachtman minority intended to produce their own bulletin in violation of the 5th to 8th April Congress decisions, and thus there was approximate justice in the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee's decision to split the organization? Question mark. Everything suggests that the minority had indeed intended to do that, but then why not wait for them to act and proceed against them when they acted and for what they did? Question mark. A majority anxious to avoid a split would have been conciliatory with the decisions the majority had won at the convention. It would have been eager to make it plain that the minority would not be discriminated against in party activity, positions, etc. It would have followed Trotsky's recommendations from October 1939 to avoid linking the political arguments to, quote, the perspective of a personal degradation, i.e. demotions, loss of prestige, disqualifications, end quote, and to establish, quote, all the organizational guarantees for the minority, end quote. The timing and content of Cannon's motions were designed to produce the opposite effect. The majority wanted a split. Cannon's book, Struggle for a Proletarian Party, written and published just before the split, makes that plain. New section. Old antagonisms and the test of events. Subsequent events gave an unanswerable verdict on the charge of, quote, petty bourgeois renegacy, end quote. What was the banner of the Cannonites in their drive for a split? The, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, did not bend under bourgeois public opinion, while the U.S. entered the war in December 1941. If anything, it was the, quote, proletarian majority, end quote, who aligned themselves with bourgeois and petty bourgeois, quote, pressure, end quote, in their pro-USSR stance after the 22nd of June 1941, and did an initial fudging on opposition to the war, parenthesis, see below, end parenthesis. The Orthodox would continue for a decade and more to describe James Burnham as the inspirer of the minority. But 4 weeks after the founding of the Workers' Party, Burnham wrote a letter of resignation, announcing that Burnham no longer had anything in common with Marxism or a Marxist party. Trotsky, Burnham wrote, had been right about him. Parenthesis, see The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, page 383, end parenthesis. The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1 is going to be entirely on this channel. Or it probably is by the time this video comes out, so you'll see that. That Burnham had been a Central Socialist Workers' Party leader, writer of resolutions and articles, co-editor of the magazine was true. The idea that Burnham was the central leader of the minority, making them after his departure, quote, Burnham's orphans, end quote, never made much sense. It was a factional gambit. Sharp conflicts of the previous decade of the U.S. Trotskyist movement welled up in the Socialist Workers' Party of 1939 to 40 and broke it in two. When he sent Trotsky his polemic, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, just before the April 1940 Socialist Workers' Party conference, Cannon wrote in a covering note, quote, the dam of 10 years' patience has been broken down, end quote. Parenthesis, Dog Days, James P. Cannon vs. Max Shachtman in the Communist League of America, 1931 to 1933, page 6, end parenthesis. In 1933, the Trotskyists had come very close to splitting along roughly the same organizational lines as those on which they would split in 1940. Cannon had the majority of the National Committee against Shachtman and Martin Aburn and was determined to hold on to it one way or another. On all the political questions, there was no difference between the groups. The origin of the group-clique conflict lay in the period immediately after the formation of the separate Trotskyist organization, when Cannon had a personal and perhaps political crisis and had to get an outside job for a period of 2.5 years. He largely withdrew from work at the office and got into conflicts with the de facto leadership of the organization, Shachtman and Aburn. Cannon resisted and opposed them on such things as publishing a bi-weekly and then weekly paper. A monthly was the best they could do, he argued. There was no political basis for the intense factional conflict then, so Trotsky thought. He diagnosed the difference between the two groups as on one side, comrades with a long political experience, even before the formation of the American Communist Party, and on the other, younger comrades. In, quote, the local organizations, ... the workers, particularly those with trade union experience, go more with the majority, whereas the intellectuals, etc., who come over to the organization more or less on ideological grounds, go with the minority. This categorization is not quite exact, but is by and large correct, end quote. Trotsky linked it to the fact that in the whole previous period the group had been concerned above all with propaganda. Quote, the mere fact that both factions have a different social composition and the different traditions is not enough to necessitate a split, since every party arises from various groups, elements, etc., is not socially homogeneous and is a melting pot, ... The current situation coincides at the beginning of more energetic external work. Whether the League will become a melting pot through this work, that is the question that counts, end quote. Trotsky. Cannon and his friends used various mechanical ploys such as depriving Martin Aberin of a vote on the leading committee while one of theirs was away, trying to co-opt a Cannon supporter onto the committee, and so on. Cannon and his friends excluded Martin Aberin from the organizing and administrative work which by all accounts Martin Aberin was most suited to and Cannon was least suited to. A secretariat consisting of Cannon and Aberin was being proposed by the minority. Trotsky commented, quote, the question of the secretariat is also not quite clear to me. Of course, it is quite natural that Cannon was proposed as secretary, but if I were in Cannon's place, I might say, quote, I would in fact like a representative of the minority to work as a second secretary, end quote. That would be an attempt to settle the disputed issue collectively and through day-to-day collaboration. Frictions might indeed be eased. The personal organizational disputes are out of proportion to the maturation of the principal differences. It seems to me, in fact, that on the part of the majority an element of organizational, quote, automatism, or automatism, end quote, has played a role, ... end quote. Dog Days, page 4, parenthesis, Dog Days, page 465, end parenthesis. What in Cannon's account of 1939 to 40 was called, quote, Aberinism, end quote, the substitution of personal for political ties, is often a real issue in politics, whether it is called, quote, Aberinism, end quote, or, quote, Cannonism, end quote. In 1939, Shachtman cited as part of the evidence that a, quote, Cannon clique, end quote, ran the organization, the moves by Cannon to cinch up a, quote, Cannonite, end quote, majority on the political committee before the differences had been clearly established. Early on in the 1939 to 40 split, according to Shachtman, Cannon offered him an amicable split in which they would share the resources of the organization. Cannon did not deny it, but it was, he said, a joke. Trotsky, in joining in the demonization of the minority as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, did the very opposite of what Trotsky had recommended in October 1939. If Trotsky had lived, Trotsky would have seen in the political activity of the alleged, quote, petty bourgeois capitulators, end quote, in their stand against the USA in the war, the clearest possible evidence that he had been mistaken. Trotsky would have worked to eliminate the consequences of Trotsky's mistake. Cannon was unwilling and perhaps unable to register the, quote, mistake, end quote, that had allowed Cannon to gain control of the organization, such as Cannon never had in the organization's first 11.5 years. Reunification was incompatible with the Cannonite Zinovievite party into which the Socialist Workers' Party was reshaped after 1940. The Workers' Party had been born politically premature and only half formed. They had to sort themselves out politically on the Russian question. The discussion in the Workers' Party in 1940 produced three positions other than those who remained degenerated workers' staters, as parenthesis, most likely, end parenthesis, the bulk of the minority had been in April 1940. C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya argued that Russia was state capitalist and in fact a, quote, fascist, end quote, state. Two groups of, quote, bureaucratic collectivists, end quote, emerged. A group around Joseph Carter and including Hal Draper developed towards the view that Russia exemplified a new reactionary form of class society which theoretically could, parenthesis, so it was implied, though the earlier statements did not say this, end parenthesis, spread to be dominant in the world. They were impervious to Trotsky's considerations about the shape of history and the impossibility of a new form of society arising in, quote, one country, end quote, parenthesis, or a cluster of countries, end parenthesis, on the margins of capitalism, and then competing successfully with it. Odd thing, because that's, to my understanding, that's precisely how capitalism spread. Starting in very particular localities. That's just a side note from me. Predominantly southern England. If you take Ellen Mason's Wood and Robert Brenner seriously. Max Shachtman was not so impervious. At first, Max Shachtman developed an analysis almost identical with Trotsky's, only calling, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, what Trotsky called, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote. As did Trotsky, Shachtman saw the USSR as a freak of history, a one-off, and with at least some potentially progressive content. Shachtman remained within Trotsky's strictures and theoretical structures. Max Shachtman published an article in New International of December 1940 titled, Is Russia a Worker State? On this channel, expounding the majority view of the Workers' Party, parenthesis, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, page 272. In 1946, in response to the consolidation and expansion of the Stalinist Empire, the majority, Shachtman adopted a variant of the view of Joseph Carter. In this, they paralleled, parenthesis, as we shall see, end parenthesis, the establishment by the Orthodox in the mid-1950s of a quasi, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, perspective on the USSR as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, stably in transition to socialism and likely soon to overtake and surpass the capitalist world. New section, Trotsky's ambivalent legacy. The Trotskyist split. 4 months later, Trotsky was struck down by a Stalinist assassin on the 20th of August 1940 and died the next day. By then, most of the Trotskyist groups in Europe had been scattered and driven underground by Nazi conquest of their countries. Trotsky bequeathed to his surviving comrades a great political heritage, but also a number of seriously mistaken ideas. As well as on Stalinism, Trotsky bequeathed mistaken views on the historical prospects of capitalism and on the prospects of bourgeois democracy. In the piece, The USSR in War, parenthesis, September 1939, end parenthesis, again featured on this channel, Trotsky wrote, quote, the disintegration of capitalism has reached extreme limits. Likewise, the disintegration of the old ruling class. The further existence of this system is impossible, end quote. This huge and too absolute underestimation of the resilience of capitalism would warp and derail Trotsky's comrades' thinking for many years after his death. As for bourgeois democracy, Trotsky and the Trotskyist movement believed that there were important differences between fascist regimes and bourgeois democracy. In pre-Hitler Germany, Trotsky appealed for a workers' united front to defend the, quote, elements of proletarian democracy, end quote, embodied in the framework of bourgeois democracy. For France, the, quote, program of action, end quote, which Trotsky drafted in 1934, declared that, quote, as long as the majority of the working class continues on the basis of bourgeois democracy, we are ready to defend it with all our forces against violent attacks from the Bonapartist and fascist bourgeoisie, end quote. But with the Trotskyist own class struggle methods. In the transitional program of 1938, which is on this channel, Trotsky wrote, quote, the Fourth International does not discard the program of the old, quote, minimal, end quote, demands, ... Indefatigably, it defends the democratic rights and social conquests of the workers, end quote. In World War II, both fascist and bourgeois democratic powers formed imperialist blocs. That fact ruled out seeing the war as simply, quote, democracy versus fascism, end quote. But Trotsky went further, arguing that in the war, bourgeois democracy would disappear. All regimes would become fascist or authoritarian. There would be no difference. This was not a real answer to the questions of what weight defended bourgeois democracy should have in the war. What weight defending bourgeois democracy should have in the war. It was an evasion. It was to substitute a judgment of how things would evolve for things as they actually were, or to judge some things as they were and others by what one thought they would become. It was too mechanical and fatalistic. In March 1939, Trotsky responded to Palestinian Trotskyists who argued, quote, It is necessary to renounce defeatism in countries which are even of doubtful democratic virtue, but which are at war with the leading fascist countries, end quote, by saying that, quote, social historical laws, end quote, ruled out any bourgeois democratic outcome. Trotsky wrote this remarkable passage, quote, fascism is the inevitable product of decaying capitalism, insofar as the proletariat does not replace bourgeois democracy in time. Just how is a military victory of decaying democracies over Germany and Italy capable of liquidating fascism, even if only for a limited period? If there were any grounds for believing that a new victory of the familiar and slightly senile Entente, parenthesis, minus Italy, end parenthesis, can work such miraculous results, i.e. those counter to social historical laws, that it is necessary not only to, quote, desire, end quote, this victory, but to do everything in our power to bring it about, then the Anglo-French social patriots would be correct, end quote. Sorry, let's just rereading that to myself. Even if bourgeois democracy were likely to collapse soon, that generalization faded out such questions as the life or death of working class organizations in the next months or years. Was that all that was to be said? Was the truth that both blocs were imperialists so overwhelming that it wiped out all concern with defending bourgeois democracy in the war, that is, with defending the existence of labor movements in Nazi unconquered Europe, parenthesis, and in the USA, end parenthesis, question mark, or in 1939, Russian conquest of Finland would have meant the destruction of the Finnish labor movement. Why was that only a detail? The Trotskyist predictions proved to be seriously mistaken. In Britain, for example, wartime regulations were introduced against strikes, but not rigorously enforced. After the fall of France, the Labour Party joined a coalition government with the Tories and Liberals under a Tory Prime Minister. The Home Secretary was Herbert Morrison. Sorry, I just wanted to look him up real quick. Wikipedia says Herbert Morrison lived from 1888 to 1965. Herbert Morrison was a British politician who held a variety of senior positions in the cabinet as a member of the Labour Party. During the interwar period, Herbert Morrison was Minister of Transport during the second MacDonald ministry. Then, after losing Herbert Morrison's parliamentary seat in the 1931 general election, Herbert Morrison became leader of the London County Council in the 1930s. After returning to the Commons, Herbert Morrison was defeated by Clement Attlee in the 1935 Labour Party leadership election, but later acted as Home Secretary in the wartime coalition. Herbert Morrison organized Labour's victorious 1945 election campaign and was appointed leader of the House of Commons and acted as Attlee's deputy in the Attlee ministry of 1945 to 51. Attlee, Morrison, Ernest Bevin, Stafford Cripps, and initially Hugh Dalton formed the, quote, Big Five, end quote, who dominated those governments. Herbert Morrison oversaw Labour's nationalization program. Although Herbert Morrison opposed Aneurin Bevan's proposal for a nationalized hospital service as part of the setting up of the National Health Service. Herbert Morrison developed Herbert Morrison's social views from Herbert Morrison's work in local politics and always emphasized the importance of public works to deal with unemployment. In the final year of Attlee's premiership, Herbert Morrison had an unhappy term as Foreign Secretary. Herbert Morrison was hailed as, quote, Lord Festival, end quote, for Herbert Morrison's successful leadership of the Festival of Britain, a critical and popular success in 1951 that attracted millions of visitors to the fun-filled educational exhibits and events in London and across the country. Herbert Morrison was widely expected to succeed Attlee as Labour leader, but Attlee, who disliked him, postponed stepping down until 1955. Herbert Morrison, who was by then nearing 70 and considered too old, came a poor third in the 1955 Labour Party leadership election. So that's Herbert Morrison. Back to the text. The Home Secretary was Herbert Morrison, who had been a conscientious objector in World War I. After the formation of the coalition government with Churchill, the organized working class moved to massive acceptance that fascist invasion should be resisted. But the organized working class moved to massive acceptance that fascist invasion should be resisted in the organized working class's own way, not under state compulsion. The shop stewards movement expanded during the war. The Home Guard, quote, arming the people, end quote, was feared as a potential threat to the ruling class, organized by men such as Tom Winteringham, who fought the fascists in Spain. Alright, I'm going to look up Home Guard. The Home Guard, parenthesis, initially Local Defense Volunteers, or LDV, end parenthesis, was an unpaid armed citizen militia supporting the, quote, home forces, end quote, of the British Army during the Second World War. Operational from 1940 to 1944, the Home Guard comprised more than 1.5 million local volunteers otherwise ineligible for military service, such as those who were too young or too old to join the regular armed services. Parenthesis, regular military service was restricted to those aged 18 to 41, end parenthesis, and those in reserved occupations. Excluding those already in the armed services, the civilian police or other civil defense volunteer organizations, approximately 1 in 5 men were Home Guard volunteers. Their primary role was to act as a secondary defense force in their home locality in case of invasion by the forces of Nazi Germany. The Home Guard were initially ordered to observe and report back to General Headquarters Home Forces any airborne or seaborne invading forces in their local areas, an order extended subsequently to harassing and obstructing the advance of the enemy, even by a few hours to give the regular troops time to regroup. The Home Guard were also tasked with guarding and defending key transport intersections and factories and rear areas against possible capture by paratroops or fifth columnists. An additional prime purpose was to maintain control of the civilian population in the event of an invasion, to forestall panic and to prevent communication routes from being blocked by refugees, so as to free the regular forces to fight the Germans. During the German bombing campaign of the, quote, Blitz, end quote, the Home Guard were given the duty of seeking out and guarding unexploded bombs, in the course of which over 1,000 were killed. From 1942, the Home Guard manned coastal artillery and anti-aircraft gun and rocket batteries, releasing regular soldiers for the invasion of Europe. The Home Guard continued to man observation points and roadblocks, and to guard coastal areas of the United Kingdom and other strategically important sites such as airfields, factories, and explosive stores, until late 1944, when they were stood down. They were formally disbanded on the 31st of December 1945, 8 months after Germany's surrender. Men aged 17 to 65 years could join the Home Guard, although the age limits were not strictly enforced. One platoon had a 14-year-old and 3 men in their 80s enrolled in that platoon. Service was unpaid, parenthesis, although out-of-pocket expenses could be claimed, end parenthesis, but gave a chance for older, inexperienced soldiers to support the war effort. So that's the Home Guard. And this Tom Winteringham. Wikipedia says that man, are you fucking with me? Goddamn internet in this house is so bad. Hopefully by the time I'm done reading this video, the internet will somehow magically come back to life, and I'll be able to finish this goddamn thing and find out who Tom Winteringham was. Back to the text. Wait. Tom Winteringham. Alright. Thomas Henry Winteringham, parenthesis, 15th of May, 1898 to 16th of August, 1949, end parenthesis, was a British soldier, military historian, journalist, poet, Marxist, politician, and author. Thomas Winteringham was a supporter of the Home Guard during the Second World War and was one of the founders of the Commonwealth Party. And it says that the Commonwealth Party was a socialist political party in the United Kingdom with parliamentary representation in the House of Commons from 1942, parenthesis, the middle of the Second World War, end parenthesis, until 1946. Thereafter, the Commonwealth Party continued to function essentially as a pressure group until 1993. It says that its ideologies in the section was socialism, commandership, syndicalism, and left libertarianism. Very interesting. Despite the patchily enforced wartime regulations against strikes, that is back to the text. Well, actually, let me read that sentence. The Home Guard, quote, arming the people, end quote, was feared as a potential threat to the ruling class, organized by men of the left, such as Tom Winteringham, who had fought the fascists in Spain. Despite the parenthesis, patchily enforced, end parenthesis, wartime regulations against strikes, it could be argued that in Britain there was an expansion of bourgeois democracy during the war. Even the conscript army was not quite the old army. Lectures and talks became forums for real discussions in which leftists could and did speak freely. The Eighth Army had fought in North Africa and in Italy. Wikipedia says that the Eighth Army, United Kingdom, was a field army of the British Army during the Second World War. The Eighth Army was formed as the Western Army on the 10th of September 1941 in Egypt, before renamed the Army of the Nile, and then the Eighth Army on the 26th of September. The Eighth Army was created to better control the growing Allied forces based in Egypt and to direct their efforts to lift the siege of Tobruk via Operation Crusader. The Eighth Army later directed Allied forces through the remaining engagements of the Western Desert Campaign, oversaw part of the Allied effort during the Tunisian Campaign, and finally led troops throughout the Italian Campaign. During 1943, the Eighth Army made up part of the 18th Army Group before being assigned to the 15th Army Group, parenthesis, later the Allied armies in Italy, end parenthesis. Throughout the Eighth Army's campaigns, the Eighth Army was a multinational force, and the Eighth Army's units came from Australia, British India, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Cyprus, the Free French Forces, Greece, Newfoundland, New Zealand, Poland, Rhodesia, South Africa, Mauritius, as well as the United Kingdom. Significant formations that the Army controlled included the British 5th, 10th, 13th, and 30th Corps, as well as the 1st the 1st Canadian Corps and the 2nd Polish Corps. So that's the 8th Army. Back to the text. The 8th Army had fought in North Africa and in Italy. In 1944, the 8th Army's, quote, soldiers, parliament, end quote, responded to Howes and the bourgeois press against striking engineering apprentices in Tyneside by coming out for the right to strike and declaring that this right was one of the things they were fighting for. I was seeing if there's anything of the soldiers' parliament. This was a Britain in political ferment, working its way toward the Labour landslide election victory of 1945, the creation of the modern welfare state, and the more or less peacefully won independence of India, Pakistan, Burma, and Sri Lanka, which followed. The Labour election victory was not our socialist revolution, but progress the Labour election victory undoubtedly was. The main British Trotskyist group, the Workers' International League, following the Socialist Workers' Party USA, took up the so-named, quote, proletarian military policy. Wikipedia says the Workers' International League was a Trotskyist group that existed in Britain from 1937 to 1944. Oh, it actually has a whole piece on the proletariat military policy. I'll read about its formation. Why the fuck not? The Workers' International League was formed in 1937 by members of the militant group who had split due to false allegations from the leadership that the group that Ralph Lee, born Raphael Levy, end parenthesis, then a newly arrived South African member, had misled a strike and used the strike funds to move to England. The split took around a third of the membership of the militant group and 4 of its sub-branches, including Jock Haston and Ted Grant. The group remained in the Labour Party, where they published Searchlight, edited by Jerry Healy, which in September 1938 was replaced by the magazine Youth for Socialism, which in its own turn was renamed Socialist Appeal in 1941 as a result of the Workers' International League's turn of focus away from the Labour Party. The group also produced a theoretical journal, Workers' International News. Workers' International League grew with recruits from the Labour Party, the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Independent Labour Party, and the militant group. The Fourth International was formed in 1938, and the Workers' Independent League refused to merge into the newly formed official British affiliate, the Revolutionary Socialist League, itself a regroupment of the militant group and others. They requested either affiliate or sympathizer status to the International, but were rejected. And this is the piece. I'm going to skip everything else, but I'm going to skip to the piece about proletarian military policy. And I'll read the introduction about the outbreak of World War II. It's only a couple sentences. Unlike the Revolutionary Socialist League, the Workers' Independent League readily adopted the proletarian military policy. Developed by Trotsky in his last writings and expanded upon and advocated by James P. Cannon and the Socialist Workers' Party. The Workers' Independent League campaigned for the creation of workers' militias instead of the Home Guard, deep air raid shelters for workers, and after 1941 against the pro-war, anti-strike position of the Communist Party of Great Britain. I'm going to read the introduction real quick to the proletarian military policy. The proletarian military policy was a policy adopted by the Fourth International in response to World War II. The proletarian military policy was an attempt to apply transitional demands such as trade union control of military training and the election of officers to transform what it characterized as an imperialist war into a revolutionary struggle against Nazism. Alongside his call for an unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, Trotsky outlined the approach to be adopted by Marxists who were conscripted into the military. Quote, "We are absolutely in favor of compulsory military training and in the same way for conscription. Conscription, yes. By a bourgeois state, no. We cannot entrust this work as any other to the state of the exploiters. In our propaganda and agitation, we must strongly differentiate these two questions. That is, not to fight against the necessity of the workers being good soldiers or of building up an army based on discipline, science, strong bodies, and so on, including conscription, but against the capitalist state which abuses the army for the advantage of the exploiting class," end quote. Trotsky. The policy provoked controversy within the Trotskyist movement, with some seeing it as a concession to social patriotism. In the American Socialist Workers' Party, Max Shachtman and James Burnham characterized the Soviet Union as, quote, "state capitalist," end quote, and disagree with the policy. Well, that's Wikipedia being wrong. That's not true. You're lucky to have me here, so I can tell you that it's not true. That they didn't call it state capitalist. And the workers, back to the Workers' Independent League. The majority of British workers supported the war because they had a genuine fear of an invasion by Nazi Germany and a desire to defeat Nazism. At the same time, the British ruling class could not be trusted to fight a war that would decisively defeat Hitler, since they had supported and helped Hitler before the war. Only the working class could successfully carry out such a struggle. Therefore, the Workers' International League conducted revolutionary work in the armed forces upon conscription and agitated for a revolutionary war against fascism and for socialism. The Workers' International League was reflected in the slogan, quote, "First Hitler, then Churchill," end quote. The military establishment organized the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, which was intended to educate soldiers about current events. Whereas the Workers' International League members were based, they took control of the classes and used them to promote revolutionary ideas. In the case of the Workers' International League member Frank Ward, his revolutionary work was so successful that the military was compelled to give him a, quote, "honorable discharge," end quote, from the Air Force and sent him home in order to prevent him from conducting revolutionary activity. In a similar incident, the Cairo Forces Parliament was shut down because of the growing support of the revolutionary ideas promoted by the Workers' International League. They were elected to the position of Prime Minister and Home Secretary. Their revolutionary work was successful in winning the support of many soldiers, as described by Ted Grant. Quote, "From the reports of our soldier comrades, the 8th Army soldiers were saying that after the war they would refuse to disarm and return to Britain with guns to ensure that things would change. This was the mutinous mood that was developing amongst these troops. At the 1943 conference of our tendency, I made the point, to illustrate the thing graphically, that the military establishment, though it their army, I made the point to illustrate the thing graphically, that the military establishment thought it their army, but in fact the soldiers of the 8th Army were in rebellion. This reflected the revolutionary developments in the army. It was our 8th Army in that it was being transformed, it was becoming revolutionary, and in the process of moving over to the side of the working class," end quote. Ted Grant. Okay, I think I can go back to the text now. The main British Trotskyist group, the Workers' International League, following the Socialist Workers' Party USA, took up the so-named, quote, "proletarian military policy," end quote. It meant that the Trotskyists accepted the need for a war against fascism and the threat fascism posed to the labor movement, but distrusted the way the government conducted and was likely to conduct that war. The policy of the British (and U.S.) Trotskyists in the war was at least as a close relative of, quote, "revolutionary defensism," end quote. It had a real meaning in Britain under threat of Nazi invasion, which it did not have in the USA. Shachtman's heterodox group, the Workers' Party, believed that bourgeois democracy would go down before authoritarianism in the war, no less than Cannon's Orthodox Socialist Workers' Party and the now shadowy Fourth International, which the Socialist Workers' Party ran from New York, did. Labor Action, the magazine, reported on the 3rd of June 1940 that all civil liberties had ended in Britain. Quote, "The Churchill government, has, rushed bills through, which give the cabinet totalitarian powers equal to those of Hitler. The new powers wipe out all the guarantees of civil liberties and individual rights won in long and hard struggles, for over 1,000 years, end quote. That was the substitute expectation for analysis and accurate reporting. The difference between the Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party was that, though the Workers' Party could be misled by such ideas, the Workers' Party did not regard them as fetishes. The Workers' Party did not believe, as Cannon did, that the prestige of the leadership rested on never being wrong, that is, in practice, on covering up when inevitably they did get something wrong. As Shachtman recorded, quote, "Before the war, we had all declared in our analyses that once the war got underway, the political differences between the totalitarian and democratic countries would dwindle rapidly, Refusing to be guided by disproved assertions of yesterday, we established the facts early in the war and proceeded to orient our activities accordingly," end quote. Parenthesis, 5 years of the Workers' Party, April 1945, end parenthesis. I've already read, actually, all the primary source documents from this book, so I'm reading the introduction last. So that piece is in this is going to be on the channel. In the USA, despite wartime regulations, repression of socialists was a great deal less than it had been in World War I and its aftermath. Quote, "Pluto-democracy," end quote, democracy dominated by the rich but still allowing leeway to the working class, thrived. And then from 1943 to 45, in the Europe liberated from fascist rule and Nazi occupation, the development of bourgeois democratic regimes confronted the Trotskyists with yet another unexpected development. The Workers' Party adjusted early and fully. The Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party's co-thinkers in Europe did not. The Socialist Workers' Party insisted that bourgeois democratic regimes, quote, "new Weimar republics," end quote, were impossible in post-war Europe. There would at best be Bonapartist regimes, semi-dictatorial regimes under which the state machine, led by some self-said Napoleonic hero like de Gaulle in France, would rise above parliament and society. As late as 1949, parenthesis, an article by Ernest Mandel, bracket Germain, end bracket, in Fourth International of April 1949, end parenthesis, the Orthodox were arguing that, quote, "the characteristic form of the state in our time, bracket, is," end bracket, "the totalitarian state within whose framework the police dictatorship, parenthesis, open as under fascism or thinly veiled as, bracket, in," end bracket, the regimes now being established in several Western European countries, end parenthesis, corresponds to the extreme concentration of economic and state power and to the permanent crisis of the regime, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Obscurantisms crossbred and multiplied. One second. New section, the fallibility of Trotsky. It is impossible not to attach to Trotsky much of the blame for what happened in 1939 to 40, and for the malign consequences that warped the post-Trotskyist movement. How much Trotsky's personal condition and the circumstances Trotsky lived in contributed to that can only be surmised. Was the raging of the petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, parenthesis, and Trotsky's tolerance of Cannon's raging factionalism, end parenthesis, displaced feeling about the world he saw taking shape? In the diary Trotsky kept for a while in 1935 while living in France, Trotsky compared himself to a wise old physician, compelled to watch helplessly as fools, charlatans, assassins, and traitors destroyed someone very dear to him. 5 years later, he had to discuss the question, what if the working class and labor movements fail? What sort of world would it be then? At worst reckoning, Trotsky said it would be a world in which the Marxists would have to work out a, quote, minimum program, end quote, to defend, quote, the slaves of the new bureaucratic collectivist society, end quote. In Trotsky's, quote, testament, end quote, written in February 1940, Trotsky asserted his right to decide when to die, if his health continued to deteriorate, that is, to commit suicide. W.B. Yeats, in old age, defined himself, mind, spirit, and awareness as a sentient creature, quote, tied to a dying animal, end quote. Trotsky embodied Bolshevism and the legacy of the workers' revolution in Russia, but it was Bolshevism tied to a dying animal, to an old, tied, dying animal, confronting an increasingly hellish world in which the hopes and beliefs that had sustained Trotsky politically for over 4 decades were put in question by events and by the, quote, syphilitic and, quote, leprous, end quote, parenthesis, Trotsky's words, end parenthesis, condition to which Stalinism had reduced so much of the working class movement. There is no mystery in Trotsky's exasperation with Shachtman and Shachtman's comrades, or in Trotsky's alliance with Cannon. There is no mystery in Trotsky's fallibility. We need to record Trotsky's fallibility, try to learn from Trotsky's fallibility, pick up the pieces, and move on. New section. The Fourth International and the USA's War. The two Trotskyist groups, Cannon's Socialist Workers' Party and Shachtman's Workers' Party, moved apart politically after April 1940, also in their response to the USA in World War II. Neither supported the Allies in the war, though the Orthodox continued to support China in China's war against Japan. The heterodox saw China as having become an American tool in the war, end parenthesis. The Workers' Party responded to U.S. embroilment in the World War after 7th of December 1941 in what might be called the traditional early Comintern way. Immediately on the U.S. entering the war, the Workers' Party issued a ringing manifesto that denounced the war. It appeared on the front page of Labor Action of the 15th of December under the headline, quote, World in Flames, end quote, which again will be on the channel. The war was an imperialist war on both sides, said the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party opposed the USA going to war, and the Workers' Party did not want the U.S. government to win. The working class should not abate its class struggle during the war, but accelerate it. Against the government, the Workers' Party backed pacifists opposing the war and refusing to fight in it. The young men of the Workers' Party and the Young People's Socialist League, however, believed that they should go with their generation and let themselves be conscripted into the armed forces. A high portion of the heterodox Trotskyists, who were generally younger than the Orthodox, were taken into the military machine, seriously sapping the strength of the small party. The remaining activists of the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, took the wartime opportunities for jobs in industry. Hal Draper and Ann Draper, for example, became shipyard workers. The predictions and, quote, warnings, end quote, to the minority that the refusal to back the USSR and Finland was the first, quote, social patriotic sinfall, end quote, of the Trotskyists in the war, and the deduction that this political tendency would not swim against the patriotic tide. The predictions and, quote, warnings, end quote, to the minority that the minority's refusal to back the USSR and Finland was the first, quote, social patriotic sinfall, end quote, of the Trotskyists in the war, and the deduction that this political tendency would not swim against the patriotic tide of mainstream America once the USA entered the war. Those were shown by what the heterodox did in the war to be the opposite of the truth. The Workers' Party behaved in the full spirit of Liebknecht, Luxemburg, Eugene Debs, Lenin, and Trotsky. For them, it was all politically and personally straightforward. And the Orthodox Trotskyists? The Socialist Workers' Party response to the U.S. entering the war was downright strange. The front page headlines of the issue of The Militant just after the U.S. entered the war told the reader, quote, War reinstates 1917 Espionage Act, end quote. And John G. Wright wrote of an imminent Russo-Japanese war, nothing at all on the USA's war itself. The militant did not comment directly on the USA's entry into war, or declare that the Socialist Workers' Party was opposed to this war by the USA until the issue of the 24th of January 1942. 47 days or nearly 7 weeks later, when it finally did comment on the war, it did so in the name of the Socialist Workers' Party as an organization, but not in, when it did finally comment on the war, it did so not in the name of the Socialist Workers' Party as an organization, but in a personal statement by James P. Cannon, the Socialist Workers' Party's National Secretary. On the 3rd of January 1942, an editorial in the left-hand column of the front page of the Militant carried the headline, pushing the paper's masthead aside to the right of the page, quote, "How Labor Can Strike Hitler a Mortal Blow," end quote. Parentheses, see this volume, page 573, end parentheses. How? Workers' and farmers' governments in Britain and the USA would evoke an anti-Hitler revolution in Poland, in Germany. Why did I say Poland? Evoke an anti-Hitler revolution in Germany. The article is linked to the war, but in political substance it could have been written at any time since Hitler came to power in 1933. In January 1942, it signaled that the Socialist Workers' Party was in the fight against Hitler. Quote, "We Trotskyists want the destruction of Hitlerism and a, quote, lasting peace," end quote, end quote. That seems to have been the point of publishing the article then. Thus the Orthodox started printing advice, parenthesis, albeit addressed to the working class, and parenthesis, on how to down Hitler before they had said plainly whether they supported or opposed the USA in the war. The signal given was that they supported it. From the point of view of the USSR and its defense, the USA's entry into war against Hitler, and thus into alliance with the USSR, was very good news. That had to be one of Cannon's concerns in the 6 weeks or so in which he mulled over his response. The gap between the USA's entry into war and the Socialist Workers' Party's response suggests that for them, the response was not at all straightforward. In the epoch of the, quote, proletarian military policy, end quote, parenthesis, see below, end parenthesis, so much had changed on conscription, on their attitude to militarism, and on the general necessity of a, quote, anti-fascist, end quote, war, and that Orthodox had, as we shall see, become such whole-hog, quote, patriots, end quote, for the USA's Russian ally, that everything connected with the war had become a more or less new question. The Cannonites would eventually proclaim as one of the chief crimes or mistakes of Stalin, reliance on his bourgeois allies, the USA and Britain. Cannon had evidently to work hard to arrive at that position. The Militant of the 24th of January 1942 announced that the, quote, Trotskyist leader, end quote, Cannon, had issued a statement which it summarized. Dated 22nd of December 1941, the full statement was printed in 4th International for January 1942, which the paper reported had come out just then, parenthesis, i.e. not at the start of the month, end parenthesis. The, quote, 22nd December, end quote, statement had either been kept hidden for a month or backdated by a month. The Militant did not print it in full until the 7th of February, 2 calendar months after Pearl Harbor and the USA's entry into the war. There's a picture of the socialist appeal from this time. It says, the headline says, "Working men, this is not our war. It is a war of the bosses. Down with the war." This is from the pictures from 1939. That was when Hitler and Stalin were allied. Back to the text. Later, Cannon would be angered by any reference to the Socialist Workers' Party's tardiness. At the Socialist Workers' Party convention 10 months later, Cannon denounced those who said Cannon had hesitated as, quote, liars, end quote. Remember, Cannon said, that the Socialist Workers' Party leaders did not repudiate their anti-war politics in the courtroom. That, quote, deed, end quote, parenthesis, or non-deed, end parenthesis, Cannon asserted, spoke louder than any written statement could. Quote, no misunderstanding has been possible, ... Those who pretend otherwise are liars and provocateurs, not misunderstanding people and not honest opponents, end quote. Parenthesis, the Militant, October 2nd, 1942, end parenthesis. Not doing the opposite, not declaring positive support for the war, was stronger than an explicit statement against the war could be, ... Cannon, in his evidence at the Minneapolis trial, parenthesis, 27th of October to 8th of December 1941, end parenthesis, in which eventually Cannon and 17 other Socialist Workers' Party's members were sentenced to go to jail for, quote, advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government, end quote, had expounded the Socialist Workers' Party's general attitude to imperialism and imperialist war, and that section of the evidence was published in the Militant dated 6th of December 1941, the day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Probably the Socialist Workers' Party leaders feared that their organization would be outlawed. The Socialist Workers' Party's leaders expected the severe repression that opponents of World War I had faced from the, quote, liberal, end quote, government of Woodrow Wilson. But whatever the Socialist Workers' Party's calculations, to issue, as the Workers' Party did, a ringing and far denunciation of an American war which they opposed was surely their first political duty. New section. The Proletarian Military Policy. On the 27th and 29th of September 1940, the Orthodox Trotskyists called a conference and made a new departure which, according to Cannon, quote, telescoped, end quote, so that they would be, quote, carried out simultaneously, end quote, the tasks of defeating Hitler's fascism and those of overthrowing the U.S. bourgeoisie, parenthesis, Socialist Appeal, 26th of October 1940, end parenthesis. This, the Orthodox said, was, quote, proletarian militarism, end quote, for an age of all-pervasive militarism. They based themselves on some remarks of Trotsky's, parenthesis, quote, discussions with Trotsky, end quote, 12th to 15th of June 1940, writings 1939 to 40, end parenthesis. The Trotskyist organization would now have to be, quote, a party of a new type, end quote. It would have to, quote, adapt itself to universal militarism, be highly centralized with iron discipline in its ranks, end quote. The Trotskyist organization would no longer oppose conscription, as the Trotskyist organization had done up to then, parenthesis, in a front-page-led article on the 29th of June 1940, for example, end parenthesis. Rather, it would support military training, but demand that military training be done under the control of trade unions and that union-run, government-financed schools for officers be set up. This was, the Orthodox said, the extension into military affairs of the daily struggle of the unions and the factories and the bosses. With the bosses. In fact, it was a proposal that the trade unions contend with the government for control of the army, so that they would back the USA in the war against fascism? ? No, they explained. It was an inter-imperialist, not an anti-fascist war. The ruling class could not properly wage an anti-fascist war or be trusted with doing so. As far as I know, the Orthodox made no effort, parenthesis, and neither did the HETERODOX, end parenthesis, to organize their comrades drafted into the armed forces for political work there. For a while, much was made of this, quote, new, end quote, approach to the press of the Orthodox. Then it subsided to a reference in the regular 8 or 9 point platform, which appeared in the Militant each week, together with an occasional call on the press for trade union officers' training schools. That may mean that criticism of it had hit home, but the approach was not abandoned. For example, the Militant contributed, quote, constructively, end quote, to the public debate opened up by a dispute in 1943 between the U.S. commanders demanding a larger army and dissenting Democrat and Republican politicians, parenthesis, the militant, 20th of February 1943, end parenthesis. In practice, the shift meant that the Orthodox dropped their once vociferous opposition to conscription and softened their opposition to the war into one of de facto political acquiescence, but with the caveat of a, quote, demand, end quote, for trade union controls that could not possibly be realized without an advanced state of dual power. Bracket 1. Notes on pages 114 to 16. End bracket. In the country and in the armed forces. In the Socialist Workers' Party's daily reality, what was left was acquiescence in the war with big caveats and glorying in the victories of the USA's ally, Russia. The proposal to take control of the armed forces out of the hands of the government, outside of a situation of dual power or revolution, was seen by the Orthodox as a demand that would be transitional to that dual power. In reality, the idea that the army was separable from the state, while the state was stable, was political fantasy-mongering, abracadabra politics. The political acquiescence was real and immediate, as was the propaganda that militarism could not be resisted, and that the proletariat therefore needed its own version of the all-pervasive militarism, its, quote, proletarian military policy, end quote. At first, this stance included nasty and envenomed condemnation of pacifists resisting induction into the army. Parentheses, see, for example, quote, Paralyzing Poison from the Ivory Tower of Pacifism, end quote, by Joseph Hansen, Socialist Appeal, November 1940, end parentheses. Later, they took a warmer attitude to pacifist conscientious objectors. Parentheses, Cannon wrote in 1944 urging the militant to defend the Jehovah's Witnesses jailed for conscientious objection, such as Cannon met in the same prison as himself, end parentheses. The Workers' Party polemicized against the new, quote, proletarian military policy, end quote. Max Shachtman wrote that, quote, the Cannonites have given an important finger to the devil of national defensism, end quote. Parentheses, Labor Action, 4th of November 1940, end parentheses. In the trade unions, the Orthodox pursued a deliberately cautious policy. This is explained as, quote, preserving the cadre, end quote. On party guidance, Socialist Workers' Party trade unions tried to keep their heads down. By contrast, the Workers' Party members were open and visible as revolutionaries and militants. They openly sold labor action. The Socialist Workers' Party dismissed the Workers' Party approach as that of people merely, quote, visiting, end quote, in the unions. Whatever our judgment might be of the tactical advisability of caution in this or that case, the overall policy meant that the Socialist Workers' Party avoided sharp clashes with the trade union bureaucracy. James P. Cannon reckoned that the government and FBI offensive against the Socialist Workers' Party which resulted in the Minneapolis jailings had been triggered by Daniel Tobin, leader of the Teamsters Union, and his friends in the Roosevelt administration. Wikipedia says Daniel Tobin lived from 1875 to 1955. Daniel Tobin was an American labor leader and president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, parenthesis IBT, or the, quote, Teamsters, end quote, from 1907 to 1952. From 1917 to 1928, Daniel Tobin was treasurer of the American Federation of Labor. Daniel Tobin served on the Federation's Executive Council beginning in 1934 and served until his resignation in 1952. Back to the text. James Buchanan reckoned that the government and FBI offensive against the Socialist Workers' Party, which resulted in the Minneapolis jailings, had been triggered by Daniel Tobin, leader of the Teamsters Union, and his friends in the Roosevelt administration. Felix Morrow, one of those jailed, later said that the Minneapolis case had been a, quote, shot across the bows, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party from the government, and that Cannon had heeded it. Next section, Appendix. What did happen in, quote, Eastern Poland, end quote, in 1939 to 40? Trotsky's tentative interpretations of what happened in Eastern Poland when Russia took over were seminal for later, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Trotskyism. What really happened there has been pieced together by the historian Jan Gross in his book Revolution from Abroad, from testimonies written by inhabitants who were deported to the USSR. If you don't know who Jan Gross is, Jan Gross wrote a very important book called Neighbors, which is titled, according to the internet, "The Destruction of the Jewish Community in Jedwabne, Poland," which is about Polish collaborators with the Nazis, which is he's a very much hated person by the far right in Poland. If you study 20th century history of Eastern Europe, you know who Jan Gross is. But I haven't heard of this book. Where is it? Shit. You know, I'm going to look up Jan Gross, because I know who he is, but other people might not. Jan T. Gross, born 1947, is a Polish-American sociologist and historian. Jan Gross is the Norman B. Tomlinson 16 and 48 Professor of War and Society, Emeritus and Professor of History, Emeritus at Princeton University. Gross is the author of several books on Polish history, particularly Polish-Jewish relations during World War II and the Holocaust, including Neighbors, the Destruction of a Jewish Community in Jedwabne, Poland, 2001, Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, published in 2006, and with Irina Grudzinska Gross, Golden Harvest, published in 2012. And what was this book that was referenced by Matgamna? Revolution from Abroad. So the overview of the book says, Jan Gross describes the terrors of the Soviet occupation of the lands that made up eastern Poland between the two world wars, the western Ukraine and western Belarus. Gross's lucid analysis of the revolution that came to Poland from abroad is based on hundreds of first-hand accounts of the hardship, suffering, and social chaos that accompanied the Sovietization of this poorest section of a poverty-stricken country, woven into the author's exploration of events from the Soviet German-supported aggression against Poland in September of 1939 to Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. These testimonies not only illuminate Gross's conclusions about the nature of totalitarianism, but also make a powerful statement of their own. Those who endure the imposition of Soviet rule, and mass deportations to forced resettlement, labor camps, and prisons of the Soviet Union are here allowed to speak for themselves, and they do so with grim effectiveness. Back to the text. What really happened in eastern Poland when Russia took over has been pieced together by the historian Jan Gross in his book Revolution from Abroad, from testimonies written by inhabitants who were deported to the USSR. The history tells us where exiled Mensheviks got their stories from when they wrote accounts of a sort of social revolution accompanying the Russian invasion. Those accounts had an influence on Trotsky. Trotsky said so, and in Trotskyist debates. It also shows that those stories misrepresented what was happening, taking superficials as fundamentals and ignoring fundamentals. Germany had already invaded from the west on the 1st of September, 16 days before the Russian troops entered the east. In the east, the big majority of the population were Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Jewish, and Poles were mostly colonists or administrators. The Jewish government machine had substantially collapsed by the time the Russian troops arrived. Quote, killings, beatings, and destruction of property went on throughout eastern Poland for days before the Red Army actually occupied any given area and continued for several days afterwards. Ethnic hatred ran deep in the Ukrainian and Belarusian countryside, and it filled the power vacuum created by the collapse of the Polish administration with blood, end quote. There was an added social dimension to the violence since Poles and Jews, parenthesis, the main victims, end parenthesis, dominated the better-off classes. Quote, through the western Ukraine and western Belarus, in hamlets, villages, and towns, the Red Army is welcomed by ... visible friendly crowds ... largely of ... Belarusians, Jews, and Ukrainians, end quote. Hatred of Polish rule ran deep. It led many to think that Stalinist rule must be better. Jews especially welcomed the Russian army, calculating that the alternative was the rabidly anti-Semitic German army or pogroms by local Ukrainian anti-Semites. In a couple of villages allotted to Russia by agreement with Hitler, but occupied by the Wehrmacht before the 17th of September, the German army organized demonstrations to welcome the Russians. The Moscow government instructed its military commanders in Poland to let the spontaneous reprisals and chaos continue their course for a while. The chaos continued and intensified. Stalin was nervous and uneasy about the invasion. Despite protests from its German allies, Moscow publicly explained its invasion as action, quote, in order to aid Ukrainians and Belarusians threatened by Germany, end quote. It supplied Russian army commanders with political slogans. Quote, for 20 years you lived under the yoke of the masters who drank your blood. Now we have liberated you and we give you freedom to do with them as you please, end quote. Moscow supplied its troops with cash to buy supplies in the occupied territories to stop them looting and antagonizing the local people. The looting came later. After a short while, the Russian occupying army set up bodies of local government. To staff them, they often selected those who had led the ethnic violence or mere criminals released from the Russian troops when the Russian troops opened the Polish jails. Officials, police, school principals, etc. from the old regime were arrested. The Russian army encouraged land seizures and redistributions, though as a very last prelude to, quote, collectivization, end quote, reappropriation of the land by the Russian state. Waves of arrests and deportations to the USSR, parenthesis, some to labor camps, some just to remote regions, end parenthesis, followed. Hundreds of thousands of people were deported. The prisons were filled again, so full that in some of them prisoners had to try to sleep standing up. When, in 1941, Germany invaded, those prisoners were either shot en masse or forced marched to the USSR, in a smaller-scale rendition of the death marches from some concentration camps which the Nazis organized in 1944 to 45 when facing defeat and exposure by the Allies. Theodor Dahn and the pro-Stalin Mensheviks, and after them Trotsky, were very badly mistaken about Eastern Poland in 1939. That's the end of part 1. Thanks for listening.